Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about something that might be a little controversial, but it really shouldn't be. And that's when we start looking at studies on muscle activation and the bench press. It turns out that grip width doesn't impact muscle activation as far as which muscles get worked as much as people think it does. In other words, it matters a little bit, but it's not massively different. And what I mean is, when you start looking at studies, the more advanced lifters get, the less difference it seems to actually make. And that's the fascinating thing. And, we could look at biomechanics. And I think one of the things that people forget is that grip width, even though in some cases something like you might think, well, the pecs get worked harder because of a deeper stretch at certain angles, and that's true if we get wrist stacking. But when you go even wider than where your wrists are optimally stacked, you're actually getting less range of motion at the joint on the pectoral. And by that same token, when we start going with really narrow grips, our total range of motion increases. Now, even though some of that activation as far as the range of motion goes will be in triceps more, again, it seems to depend on how high your neuromuscular efficiency is. And when you look at a few novice studies that are out there, some of them, they show some questionable results. Yeah, pecs get hit considerably harder with a wider grip, while pecs and front delts. And then triceps get hit harder as the grip goes in narrower. But these are generally in untrained subjects, right, with much lower neuromuscular efficiency. And you have to keep in mind that's not going to be relevant for most people. Will it be relevant for most people in the world? Sure. But most people in the world are untrained novices. Okay? It's not going to be significant anymore. Those studies are not going to be significant when you get to the point where you're reading studies. Like if you're so interested in lifting that you're digging into scientific literature and exercise science about lifting, you've probably been fairly serious about your training for a little bit of time. You probably are. So therefore, novice studies are not really going to apply to you anymore. And we look at a few studies that have recent ones that have been done in the last couple of years. I think one that was interesting, and I've seen actually Greg Nuckols do a review of it on Stronger by Science. He came in and he said, look, the differences really aren't that significant, but they did show differences. And the trend was, well, in novice lifters, sure, we just saw like more delt activation when we went with a medium grip. Well, why? Because it gets the deepest stretch, right? You have that deepest stretch in the bottom, just like when we found with cambered bars, the delt activation goes up. Now people say, but that's a deeper stretch on the pec. Shouldn't it be more pec? Well, we would think so, but it turns out that the pec may not stretch as much as we think it does. It's just tendon, and then the anterior delt is taking over from there. Another reason that most really experienced powerlifting coaches will tell you that if you're really weak right off the chest, a lot of times it's a shoulder weakness. Not always pec. Pecs really become more important once the bar gets moving. Like a mid-range, if you stick in the middle, probably is your pecs. You just need to get bigger pecs. So it would make sense that we see that, particularly with untrained lifters, because that's what's going on biomechanically. Now, when they took semi-trained lifters in that same study, they took two groups and they tested all the muscles. What they found was a general trend towards no change in the pectoral activation, right? The largest part of the pectoral, they found it didn't matter. Okay? With a slight bias towards as the grip got wider, a little more front delt. What they also found is that as the grip got narrower, the upper chest was hit slightly harder and the triceps get hit slightly harder. That's what they found in trained subjects. Now, keeping in mind, these trained subjects were not powerlifting level strong. They had an average bench press of, I think, 1.25 times their body weight. So what does that mean? Well, it means if they were 200 pounds, they had a sub 300 pound bench press. Okay? It means they were probably around a 250 if they weighed 200. If they weighed 180, not quite as much, right? We're down around 220, 225. That's not bad. I mean, that's trained, right? This is not a novice, but it's also not, definitely not strong. They don't have a full strength base yet. So what has happened in studies when they looked at powerlifters? When they looked at competitive powerlifters and they hooked EMGs up and tested them, guess what they found? They couldn't tell them apart. There was no statistical significant difference between a wide, medium, and a closed grip on an EMG in terms of pec, delt, or tricep activation. What? Why? Well, because EMG measures nervous system, right? What is an EMG doing? It's looking at nervous system activity in that muscle. Not always telling you about which fibers are contracting per se, but it's telling you about motor units, neural activation. Well, what do you expect powerlifters to be good at? What is the one thing that we expect a powerlifter to be good at? Having a high neural drive. Because that's what we do for 1-rep maxes. We tend to be good at 1-rep maxes because we have a high neural drive. We've trained for it. Doing really heavy lifts will do that. For 1 rep requires us to do that. We have to train our nervous systems to fire every muscle as hard as possible in a movement. And that's exactly what they found. Does that mean the muscle fiber activation and work done would be different? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It might be different. It might not. We don't know. But we just know that the nervous system activity was the same. So what's the real differences we found? What we've actually found the biggest differences is when you look at rep range and percentage of max. That actually went, again, only looking at an EMG, which doesn't tell us everything. What we found is that the closer you get to a 1-rep max, that actually has a much more significant impact than your grip width on where the activation seems to be. And there's a trend towards, as the weight gets heavier and closer to a max, the pecs get used as far as a proportion goes slightly less. The triceps get used more, particularly the long head, which is a fascinating thing because we don't think of the long head as being worked particularly well on a bench press, but apparently on a max, it is. So the take home there would be if you want to develop a lot more pectoral from your benching, you should probably be doing slightly higher reps. Now, what we mean by higher reps, we're talking 8 or more. So an 8-rep set will achieve that better than, say, a 4 or 5-rep set will. And when you start getting really heavy, but again, we're talking a 3-rep max or heavier, you get more and more tricep activation. Okay. So that could be the trends you could think about towards for muscle building or muscle activation. But then again, we could just do more tricep work instead of trying to do bunches of really heavy singles to build our triceps. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.